No expansion and a shared future through good relations with all nations. Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, during his annual press conference, spells out China's foreign policy. Our panelists weigh in right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. After talking about China's economic roadmap in the two sessions, let's focus on diplomacy. Earlier today, after wrapping up of the first session of the 13th National People's Congress, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, during his annual press conference, briefed the media at the Golden Hall inside the Great Hall of the People. In the meeting, Premier Li took questions from journalists from home and abroad, and he said China has no intention to pursue expansion. Take a listen.
中国过去的发展是在
China has achieved its development in a peaceful international environment. I want to emphasize 2 points. One, China will not seek expansion. It is now a developing country and it has no intention to pursue expansion. What China wants is to develop relations with all other countries and regions on the basis of mutual respect and mutual benefits, and to work with others to build a community with a shared future.
For more on the annual two sessions and China's foreign policy, let's join Wang Yiwei, who is a Rang Monnet Chair Professor of Renmin University. He is also the Director of the Center for European Studies. Welcome, sir, to our program. Meanwhile, joining us once again in New York, Fred Tang, the President of America-China Public Affairs Institute, especially invitee of this year's two sessions. And we are hoping another American guest is going to join us in a few minutes. Before that happens, let me go to you, Mr. Tang, about China's foreign policy. Certainly, China has to explain a lot to the rest of the world about what exactly its agenda is. What do you think exactly it is?
Well, I think this time President Xi has a very strong team, a hand-picked and strategically placed team. Not only himself, but his vice president, Mr. Wang Qishan, is very well versed at dealing internationally. His vice premier, Mr. Liu He, is very, very well versed in dealing with international community. The foreign minister and state councilor, Mr. Wang Yi, again, is very, very well versed in dealing with it. So he has a very strong team, and including Mr. Wang Yang, the chairman of CPPCC, who can do people-to-people exchange. So he has a very strong international team that can be dispatched anytime and to deal with any of the issues. So I think that is really what's going on in terms of the foreign diplomacy. President Xi has it pretty much ready.
It seems that Mr. Tang wants to stick to his point about a strong team could make a lot of things happen. But to you, Professor Wang, strategically, is Chinese foreign policy have any shift of focus, just say, compared to decades ago?
Well, continuity, I think, the first Chinese. But if there's a shift, means Chinese economic growth structure shift from export to import to attract FDI to invest a lot along the Belt and Road countries. So, of course, the Chinese foreign policy will accordingly more active and provides public goods to the world and more focus on global governance.
And of course, one of the most important bilateral relations China has to deal with is the U.S.-China relations, which these days have attracted so much attention, always in the headline, no matter what the tweets are. So, Mr. Paul, coming from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, he's the vice president there. Douglas Paul, welcome to our program as well. Thank you for taking your time, sir. So what do you say with the words and also the concepts flying around during the two sessions? Do you have a better idea of the future direction China foreign policy, particularly regarding China's relations with the United States?
Well, you know, if I have to draw a broad conclusion, I think China's major priorities are mostly domestic, and that China is looking to protect its interests and its claims to sovereignty in its nearby neighborhood, and is not looking for a conflict with the United States. I think you can make those general characterizations. But when you talk about the nearby sovereignty claims, the so-called core interests, there are areas where the U.S. and China will rub up against each other. And I think the summary speech by President Xi touched on this question a bit indirectly in talking about avoiding splitism and indirectly referencing Taiwan as an issue.
Professor Wang, about that, the two issues.
Two issues for China's relations with the United States: trade.
One that mentioned is that, of course, the Taiwan Act that has been recently debated so much, a legislation put forward by President Trump, and also the Capitol Hill. The other thing, of course, is the trade issue between China and the United States.
Firstly, about trade, I think President Trump wants to use the trade to divide and rule of the world, including the European countries. Some of the European countries want to seek exemption from the United States, and then others will be punished, like Germany, and because it sells too much steel to the United States, and China also. So which make China and Germany should work more closely, actually, to fight against this protectionism. For Taiwan, President Trump, planned again of the card of the Taiwan issue and want to make a deal with China. So Taiwan issue and trade, they will make a deal comprehensively with the Chinese government.
Will China make a deal about Taiwan?
They want to make a deal. They want to make a deal.
Yeah. But will China make a deal about the issue
of
Taiwan?
No, for China, definitely, Taiwan is our core national interest, our domestic affairs, which cannot be negotiated and not be trade off. But Trump, because it's from commercial consideration, they want to make a deal.
Right. We all understand that logic. But the thing is how to proceed from here. Used as a bargaining chip, that could be understandable, but China has its own principle, Mr. Keqiang.
Well, I think that it would be a mistake to use this as a bargaining chip.
Mr. Keqiang, please, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry, Doc. Well, I think it would be a mistake to use this as a bargaining chip, and we saw that through the phone conversation early on when President Trump won the election. I do think that this is a unilateral decision where President Trump signed the act, and there are many people on Taiwan is very worried what is the implication for such an act. Actually, the traveling has been going on for a long time, but then it's just not necessary to have such an act to enact it.
Mr. Paul.
Well, I think the Taiwan Travel Act is a way for Congress to express its unhappiness with China and its support for the values Taiwan encapsulates, and not much more than that. I don't think it changes anything in the behavior of the administration, and I'm not seeing strong incentives from the administration to try to play Taiwan as a card against China. That doesn't seem to be in their thinking, at least at the present moment, although you can find individuals here and there who might want to do that.
Mr. Paul, just to follow up on that, over the past few months, you have seen a whole sea change of personnel surrounding President Trump, the kinds of people that he has selected into the closest circle of his. What kinds of policy tendency do you think this circle of people likely to produce? And how do you think, for those of many of you who are here right on the screen, have been experts of U.S.-China relations, the two countries lead to the right direction when it comes to bilateral relations? Mr. Paul.
Well, I think we've seen an increase in the number of people who support the president's instincts to take confrontational approaches on most issues, with the big exception of how to deal with North Korea. And there it's a mixture of cooperation and confrontation. And I think that's likely to be the direction we're headed in. I see U.S.-China relations getting about as bad as they were in the late 1980s, early 90s, once again.
But Professor Wang, 80s and 90s, China was not as it is today. Today, China is stronger. I'm not saying China is going to, in a way, exercise its muscle. It's just that China has its own desire, and China needs to have its own way of development that is ever clearer. So, Professor Wang, how should we understand the current circumstances if what Mr. Paul said are exactly what is happening right now?
Well, it's not just because of the rise of the Chinese power. It's because of the rise also responsibility, because Chinese interests more and more connected with the other countries. Now China pay more attention to the international environment, not just for considering of the threat risks, but also we should put forward so-called the community of the shared future, because the world, I think, is very uncertainty. Chinese economic relations, political relations, security relations, highly interdependent with the outside. So that's the reason China pay more attention to that.
China, of course, the Chinese President Xi Jinping, Mr. Tang, in the last day of the 13th MPC, he delivered a very long speech talking about some of the very specific concepts regarding the Chinese nation, the Chinese people, the Chinese history, and the Chinese vision. One of the things he's been talking about is, of course, the future direction. And he's talking about the Chinese spirit, the can-do spirit, the innovative spirit. These all, in a way, is trying, in a way, to tell the rest of the world what does China want and where is China heading for. Given what you have just read and listened to the Chinese president, and also given what the Chinese Premier Li Keqiang during his annual press conference said, the relationship between China and the United States is going to be one between the largest developed economy and the largest developing economy. It seems that it's two categories we're talking about, not just two countries anymore. So how should we understand the next stage when it comes to the nature of relations between these two countries, and how the two countries are likely to rally the strength in order to make sure it is in its own interest, but at the same time mutual interest as well? Mr. Chen.
I'm actually quite optimistic about the U.S.-China relations. What we see in the media these days, or from the tweeting going on, it really reflects of our current presidency and his administration, or his small circle of people. I think that, you know, it is just our president's personality, and it's really does not reflect the true U.S.-China relations. Like Professor Wang earlier have talked about, also China's relations no longer is just a U.S.-China relation, but a global relationship. With its Belt and Road Initiative and so many other things, it has engaged so many nations very, very deeply. And it can, you know, obviously ignore part of the U.S. Rhetoric, and they can go on, you know, working with other nations and still building its economy and building its international relations.
Mr. Paul, what about your thought?
Well, I can understand the position just expressed, but I do think that the administration, which had a kind of a balance for the first year between people who really wanted to change everything that the U.S. government does, especially with regard to China, and then balanced against more institutional interests, long-term interests. I think the balance has really shifted to disruption, toward change. Therefore, we're going to see very soon the Section 301 measures taken to attack the large deficit that the United States has in trade with China. This will be complicated. It'll be very difficult to make happen. But they seem to be determined to press ahead with that. And it will be natural for China to respond in ways that will be pretty strong as well.
Okay. Professor Wang, here's the question. Whether the two countries, China and the United States, is likely to go into a trade war or not, we discuss it many times, even today, in our program. But let's just put that aside. Let's just say if things were getting worse, is China going to have an alternative with which that China does not have to sacrifice too much of its current conditions when it comes to trade and economic development, while at the same time be able to go around the United States in a way, at least the difficulties that the United States is trying to create for China right now? Professor Wang.
I think the trade war, so-called trade war, I think the behind it is about the responsibility of the global financial crisis and about the world economy. Why Chinese government always highlights is the developing country and the developing country economy, because about the steel overcapacity is a global phenomenon. The concept from China, from Germany, is because the global division of labor. It's not because of China's have the intention to seek the imbalance. So I think that we are persuaded President Trump to understand the globalization from more global perspective, not from the U.S. Very narrow and unilateral perspective.
What about the alternative way, Mr. Paul? If the U.S. politics continue to be what it is, well, of course, nobody could control it except those in the United States. So what would be the strategy if you could advise, in a way, for China?
For China? Well, I think that China's, as I said at the outset, China's focus on domestic issues with expanding interests abroad is something that should be continued. What's being observed most closely in the U.S. are tendencies for China to try to disturb the international system. And if I could recommend anything to be included in the leadership speeches in China, it would be to repeat the things that were said in Geneva and Davos in January by President Xi, which talked about preserving and improving the international order, not trying to overturn it.
Okay. Professor Wang, final words, very briefly.
No one wants to overthrow the international order. China and the United States benefit from this, but both sides, because the number one, number two world economy, should reform this international system to make it more inclusive, more sustainable. This our should jointly to work for that, not compete and confront with each other.
All right, there we go. A lot of discussion going on there. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. Wang Yiwei, Fred Tang, Douglas Paul. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Really appreciate it. Before we go, we'll leave you with the top sights and sounds from the two sessions. As a recap of this year's political season, we'll leave you with words from a Chinese sage who once said that running a big country is like cooking a small meal. Here's a quick look at how the Chinese government prepared all the ingredients on hand to take on the huge task. Running a big country is like cooking a small meal. That is a quote coming from Tao Te Ching. That's an ancient classic Chinese credited to the ancient Chinese sage Lao Tzu. But the logic is the same. Responsibilities are much bigger, as we're talking about the lives of 1.4 billion people. And that is what the Chinese government has committed to do. There are some important elements already. After years of hard work, the anti-corruption drive has achieved some impressive results, and it's visible everywhere. Just to give you a small example, there are slogans shown in the most visible places in the lobby of hotels where NPC deputies and CPPCC members stay during the two sessions. They are reminding everyone to be self-disciplined. More importantly, the institutional building has been set up, crystallized by the establishment of the National Supervision Commission to root out corruption both within the Chinese Communist Party and at all levels of the government. China's contribution is not only its work from within, but also beyond borders. It has been the growth engine of the world economy for quite some time. Yet the question is, the Chinese economy itself has run into problems of its own. It's too export-oriented and lack of quality growth. The supply-side structural reform has been identified to be key in meeting the rising demands of the Chinese people to have a better life. But where are the entry points for the important work to be done? Well, it is the well-known three battles, namely to deal with environmental pollution, extreme poverty, as well as the risks of the financial sector. But the question is how? Institutional reform plan has mapped it out. For example, combining the Banking Regulatory Commission and the Insurance Regulatory Commission to deal with the newly emerged risks throughout the financial sector. Another example, the establishment of the Ministry of Ecological Environment to put all environmental protection work under one umbrella. For instance, water pollution. It used to be that different agencies under different ministries handle work related to groundwater, water management, and rural water pollution. But now, with all of these functions under one roof, it could serve as a new momentum to make things work. After all, efficiency is crucial for governance. All the above-mentioned examples, as well as the reduction of ministerial entities according to the latest institutional reform plan, is designed to do the job. Knowing the pain points, designing the plan with clear reflection is always the most important step taken for good governance. It seems that China and the Chinese Communist Party have been pondering upon that question constantly over the past 5 years. Now, with a clear plan, it already has its work cut out for it. That was earlier in the Great Hall of the People. Well, after 18 days of coverage, our special programs and straight talk interview series has come to an end for the annual political season. We want to appreciate your attention, while at the same time continue to pay attention to our program World Insight with me, Tian Wei. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team who have been working very hard over the past 18 days, thanks for watching, and tune in again next time for Insights across China and around the world. Good night.